Meet the most capable CRV Honda has ever dreamed of. The all-new CRV Trail Sport Hybrid. With all-terrain tires and available enhanced traction control, it's built for wherever the day takes you. Heated front seats and a heated steering wheel, ideal for winter drives and crisp early starts. And with generous cargo space, it's ready for big gear and even bigger getaways. The CRV Trail Sport Hybrid. Learn more at honda.com/CRV.
You are tuned in to the Foul Weather Podcast, the forecast to your next successful hunt. Coming to you from the home office, Jack's Reef, New York.
Adaptive harvest management for setting waterfowl harvest regulations was formalized in 1995. It not only provides an objective decision-making tool, but it also helps improve our understanding of drivers of duck populations by testing competing models through time. Listen in as DrMike details how AHM changed duck season setting, plus a prairie update, news on hurricane season, and more. All today on the Foul Weather Podcast. In response to a massive amount of misinformation coming across your wavelengths, the Foul Weather Podcast embarked on the 2025 Data Stream series. It can be attractive to find conspiracies that help explain what you observe as a duck hunter, or maybe you even thought up some fake news yourself. The reality is that the long history of data used in waterfowl conservation and management in North America is a success story that everyone deserves to hear. I'll tell you, man, bumps and bruises we have, but dedicated we are as the duck people across Duck Country, USA. Dedicated to the long-term health of ducks and duck hunting. This series dives deep into how the population surveys, banding, and harvest surveys and models work. Join us to learn more and share this great information with all the great people across Duck Country, USA. Remember this last season? You knew where the ducks were at before the ducks knew where they were at. We are very thankful for our every week listeners. You know who you are. Those that never miss a single migration forecast episode each Monday morning throughout season. Y'all are as ate up as me about ducks, duck biology, and duck migration. Our dedicated weekly listeners can pick the best days to hunt because the Foul Weather Podcast forecasts fresh ducks hot from the north. You know where the ducks are at before the ducks know where they're at, right? Shoot the ducks from the north before they know where they're at. Also, just a reminder as well to take a minute to rate us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. We appreciate your support very, very much. I'm your host, DrMike, coming to you from the home office in Jack's Reef. First off, we are deep into it, and summer is certainly summering at the farm. We had a new water system put in at the farm last week on some of the hottest days of the year, and we were without water for nearly 5 days. The local trout stream did feel really good each day, though, for a cleanup. And, well, it happened and was, I guess, just a matter of time. Back in my 20s, when I was working on my master's degree at Tishomingo National Wildlife Refuge in south central Oklahoma, I got ehrlichiosis from tick bites. And I've avoided tick-borne diseases since then, up until about a month ago when I finally got Lyme's disease. I'm typically on preventative antibiotics about 2 to 3 times per year after removing an attached tick, but I've never gotten full-blown Lyme's disease before. I probably had it for 10 days before being diagnosed and getting on doxycycline, but everything's been getting better, so I've got in my last round for this week coming up. So I guess the world is stuck with me still. I'm going to pull through. And I am not giving medical advice, and always consult a doctor, but remember that the bullseye rash from a tick bite and Lyme's disease does not always show up in everyone, and if you have an embedded tick, I'd go to the doctor for consultation no matter what. The dangers of tick-borne diseases are too great to take chances, and if you don't catch them early, many leave long-term health problems. I myself, when I had ehrlichiosis, that was for about 4 months before I was properly diagnosed, and I ended up with about 10 years of reoccurring symptoms, including aching joints, sleep apnea, and paranoia. Yeah, this all while I was working through my master's and doctoral degrees, so I figure most grad students already have some form of paranoia, so it was not good. Anyhow, take care of yourself and get checked out if you have a tick bite. All right, let's do a check-in on the breeding ground conditions from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Pilot Biologist blog page. The basics of it are this: dry and not good in the mid-continent, okay in Alaska and the Boreal, and good to excellent in the eastern region. These are reports directly from the pilot biologists and their observers during the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Waterfowl Breeding Population and Habitat Survey, or BPOP. In their words, for North and South Dakota, extremely dry, and we expect to see poor waterfowl production overall from the region. Whew. Now, do remember that it started raining right behind the plains. As pilots hit North Dakota, it was raining like 4 to 6 inches in spots of South Dakota. But also the word on the street from those conducting brood surveys is that it doesn't look great in the Dakotas. Okay, northern Montana and southern Alberta. Conditions in northeastern Montana were much drier than the past couple of years. And once we passed north of Calgary and Red Deer, habitat improved considerably, as did waterfowl densities. It made for enjoyable and busy flights as we struggled to count all the birds. So, not all bad, right? Southern Saskatchewan. We arrived in the southern Saskatchewan grasslands to bleak conditions if you are a duck. Oof. And the Missouri Coteau can have very good waterfowl production in wet years because of the high density of wetlands. This supports high breeding waterfowl densities in a region that is mostly grazed grasslands because the hilly terrain makes farming difficult. This year, wetlands in the Coteau were mostly dry with only 10 to 25% of basins holding any water. Ooh. In another dismal report, southern Manitoba and southeastern Saskatchewan were the driest I've seen them since I started flying this area over a decade ago. Ugh. For northern Saskatchewan and Manitoba, habitat conditions were very dry across most of the southern boreal forest of Saskatchewan, but trending slightly better in the north and towards the Manitoba border. Conditions were also dry in Manitoba starting south around the pass, with general improvement once north and east of Thompson. The boreal will still produce waterfowl, but continued dry conditions will chip away at its potential. Into the boreal and southern Arctic tundra. The boreal plains of northern Alberta and northeastern British Columbia continue to experience long-term precipitation deficits. Most bogs and fens in the surveyed area were dry, and marshes, swamps, and lakes were severely recessed. And, included with this, the southern Arctic tundra experienced a late ice out after persistently below average spring temperatures. Snowfall also persisted until early to mid-June. Yikes for you southern folks. Snowfall also persisted until early to mid-June, leading to fully inundated wetlands. Late breeding waterfowl likely have ample nesting habitat availability in this region. Good stuff, right? Alaska and the Yukon we're on to now. Despite low precipitation in some areas, survey crews rated the waterfowl production outlook as generally good to excellent across most of the region. Now, the East was a better story, and that is consistent with how the flyway, the Atlantic flyway, differentiated itself from the boom or bust mid-continent years ago because of more consistent conditions and not wanting to go to a 45 or 30-day season when most of our birds over here are not derived from the mid-continent. We were wet. So southern Ontario and Quebec, in summary, I expect good waterfowl production overall from the region. Western Ontario and northern Quebec. Northern Quebec provided excellent weather for surveying and generally good habitat conditions with lots of water available on the landscape and a normal spring phenology, or kind of like how it moves along, how things thawed out. And last but not least, Maine and the Atlantic Maritimes. Overall, we expect normal to above normal waterfowl production across most of the Crew area, given the combination of normal to early spring phenology, generally good wetland conditions, and lack of severe spring weather. Now, I will tell you that Newfoundland and eastern provinces and the Maritimes are kind of in like a little bit of a droughty condition actually right now, which is odd because the rest of the east and southeast is extremely wet, which we'll get into here in a second. So a quick note on the hurricane season, which will be good news for our friends in the southeast U.S. and up the Atlantic coast. The experts have slightly downgraded the season because conditions just have not been conducive to tropical depression and hurricane development. Specifically, there's been lots of wind shear in the Caribbean that has ripped apart systems before they can form. but we've had our share of rain-producing systems, keeping many folks inundated and planting of crops for waterfowl way behind schedule in the southeast U.S. and elsewhere. If you have not thought about it, this is the year to get a consultant in to help with developing late-season moist soil conditions if you can't plant. Already had a fella reach out to us on our Instagram post and have sent him to Wildlife Strategies with Ryan Delaney, and probably going to get a site visit here coming up. Can't get crops in and is already getting barnyard grass and other things popping up. So looking forward to getting that person on track to grow some weeds for waterfowl. But still on hurricanes. To be clear, the prediction is still for 16 named storms, 8 hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes. And the season typically peaks in September, so stay tuned. We aren't through it yet. A completely different story than other years when we were looking for a tropical system to help fill wetlands. In many places this year, water is not a problem. And hey, a quick sidebar here before we really jump into the adaptive harvest management stuff. We are working on the corn episode redux. Yes, R-E-D-U-X, but we like to spell it R-E-E ducks, as in redux. It's so why are we doing the corn episode redux? Well, because some people in Louisiana are again claiming that flooded corn is the reason why mallards don't show up at some southern locales. Don't forget, this ugly head reared up before around 2005 to 2008, but once duck populations rebounded, it got really, really quiet for a long time. Now when we see the opportunity to spread their lies and spew their misinformation, they are back on the scene. Remember that what affects you seeing ducks over your blind is the duck population itself and weather. Right. Of course, disturbance and habitat quality also play a role. But when it's cold and snows up north, ducks fly south. But when it ain't cold and it ain't snowy up north, ducks have options. Pretty straightforward, folks. Up next, we dig into AHM, so please stick with us. Beckman Game Calls has it dialed in. If you want a duck call that is adjustable to your air pressure and sounds like a duck, this is it. I've blown a ton of different calls in my life, but this one is the real deal. Look, we don't endorse just anything. We are only going to put forward a call that works. The Edison by Chris Beckman of Beckman Game Calls? Yeah, this beauty sounds like a duck. I only know of one published research paper focused on what makes a duck call sound like a duck. Go look me up, and you will see that colleagues and I have the only paper published in scientific literature about what makes a duck call sound like a duck. For sure, Chris Beckman did his homework, and this call sounds like a duck. This guy knows how to make a duck call, period. But don't just take my word for it. Here's the proof. First, a hen recording, and then the Edison in the big woods of Arkansas. Visit them today at BeckmanGameCalls.com. How many days have you had empty skies over the duck blind? Your property can be more with Wildlife Strategies. It is no secret that hiring a consultant, an expert in managing water, woods, and fields, an expert in duck food, an expert in hunting pressure management, hiring a consultant yields better habitat for the critters you chase. Less empty skies, more quality days afield, more smiles for miles with family and friends. If that's your game and goal, contact Ryan Delaney at ryan@farmlg.com for a site visit. And hey, here's the deal. I'm filled up for summer 2025 with clients up north, but if our northern friends have a property in need of some love, contact me at DrMike at foulweather.co for a summer 2026 site visit. The Farmland Group is your one-stop shop for real estate brokerage, consulting, management, lending, and appraisal across Arkansas, Mississippi, Missouri, Louisiana, Georgia, Tennessee, and growing. Contact them today at farmlg.com. Hey, I'm telling you, do not hesitate because these folks are busy buying, selling, and providing consulting and management strategies that build value into your portfolio on your land. So get in the queue today. Get on their radar. Get on their books. Man, y'all won't be disappointed. Contact the Farmland Group today at farmlg.com. That's farmlg.com. And welcome back, folks. In our last episode with Dr. Jim Dabofsky, we dove a bit more into the history of AHM than expected. And if you haven't listened, go back and do so because Jim did a really great job of noting how decisions about seasons for ducks were previously set basically on whims and discussion and debate in what one might call a smoke-filled room, and very often the strongest and most persistent voices prevailed. So we ended up with jockeying seasons around. When the population was high, we ratcheted up seasons, and when they were low, we reduced seasons. It's called chasing the bee pop, and nobody knew if we were affecting anything with all those changes. And there were folks that really thought harvest was additive, or when we shot a duck, that duck 100% would not have died anyway, and we were reducing the population. And then there was the camp that felt like shooting of ducks was compensatory, whereby ducks harvested would have died anyway. The reality is that in all animal populations, harvest is somewhere in between or partially compensatory. Folks also argued about density dependence and how much of an effect it had. Was density dependence strong so that as the population of ducks increased, the population growth slowed very quickly with lower survival and reproductive output, or was it weakly density dependent? All animal populations are density dependent. That is a guiding principle behind harvest management and working to sustain the largest harvestable population through time. Because at some point, if you just let the population grow, it will negatively affect itself. So if you take out individuals by harvest, you can sustain an optimal population survival whereby you are taking individuals that would have died anyway and in a way that maximizes survival and reproductive output for others that don't die. Simply keeping the population at maximum capacity to replace itself while also maximizing harvest over an infinite time series. Now, I just said something very important. I did say maximizing harvest, but don't take that the wrong way because I also said over an infinite time series. Let's dive into that a bit. Hunters have told us that they like to shoot ducks, and please indulge me because to me that is the duh moment. Of course duck hunters like to shoot ducks, and they also don't want closed seasons, and they want to be able to duck hunt and shoot ducks well into the future. That is what we have been told. So the idea behind most duck adaptive harvest management or AHM models is to find the maximum sustained yield of duck harvest each year, and then in some cases we back off about 2% or 5% or 10% on the conservative shoulder of that harvest yield curve as a buffer to uncertainty, and use our available data to tell us how to achieve that harvest, and then estimate the expected breeding population the next year. So right off the bat, when someone says we've just had liberal seasons since 1997 and AHM is not adapting, that is just not true because it has adaptation baked into it already, and if the hunter attitudes change, then the objective function itself can change. So when someone wants to reduce seasons and says AHM is not adapting, it can change, but the overall duck hunting community would like to have the opportunity to shoot ducks and do so into the foreseeable future, and so the objective function has not changed. But it can, and that is one way the model is adaptive. We also have to understand that the only way to maximize long-term cumulative harvest is to bake in safety valves in the model that perpetuate a viable population. Whew. Might want to go back and listen to this one again over and over to really get all those details. I took a long time writing the script to make sure it was spot on, so hope y'all appreciate that hard work, folks. Okay, now on to the guts of AHM, and for this case right now, we are going to use mid-continent mallard AHM, but let's step back to the underlying principles of AHM, and this is a bit dry, but it is super important to the conversation. Some of this stuff is directly from the AHM document, so you can go read all of this stuff. I'm not making it up. It ain't fake news. It's how AHM works. In regulating waterfowl harvest, managers face 4 fundamental sources of uncertainty. 1, environmental variation, or the temporal and spatial variation in weather conditions and other key features of waterfowl habitat. An example is the annual change in the number of ponds in the prairie pothole region, where water conditions influence duck reproductive success. Number 2, partial controllability. And think about this. We set seasons, but we don't control how hunters behave, right? So partial controllability, or the ability of managers to control harvest only within limits. The harvest resulting from a particular set of hunting regulations cannot be predicted with certainty because of variations in, guess what? Weather conditions each year, timing of migration, that's what the Fowl Weather Podcast does, hunter effort, and other factors. Number 3, partial observability. We can't count all the ducks, and we don't always count them correctly. So we understand that this is some uncertainty, right? But there's other key population attributes, reproductive rate and harvest. So we only really monitor that within a level of partial observability. There is still some uncertainty there. And then number 4, structural uncertainty. We have an incomplete understanding of biological processes. A familiar example is the long-standing debate about whether harvest is additive to other sources of mortality or whether population compensation happens, as we've discussed before. So AHM is applied with these key uncertainties in mind and works to reduce these uncertainties at the same time by having 1, a limited number of regulatory alternatives which describe flyway-specific season lengths, bag limits, and framework dates. 2, a set of population models describing various hypotheses about the effects of harvest and environmental factors on waterfowl abundance. 3, a measure of reliability or weight for each population model. And 4, a mathematical description of objectives of harvest management by which alternative regulatory strategies can be compared.
This MailChimp-verific jingle is brought to you by MailChimp.
MailChimp, your marketing with AI and more. Advanced automations to connect to your store. MailChimp, your marketing and boost your clicks. Multi-channel campaigns now with SMS. That's lit.
MailChimp your marketing today with the #1 AI-powered email marketing and automation platform, Intuit MailChimp. #1 based on publicly available data on competitors' customers. Plans vary. SMS available as add-on. Visit MailChimp.com.
So the season-setting matrix for mid-continent mallards has 4 options, and I'm going to go over the Mississippi flyway options because they are a bit more liberal in the Central and Pacific flyways, but all of this can be found, again, in the AHM documents produced each year by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So the options are a liberal season, which is a 60-day season with a 6 duck daily limit, 4 of which can be mallards with 2 hens. A moderate package, which is a 45-day season, a 6 duck limit with 4 mallards, 1 of which can be a hen. And the restrictive package, which is 30 days with a 3 duck limit, 2 of which can be mallards and 1 a hen. And then there is the closed season option, which is the thing we really try to avoid. Now, the matrix that we use to determine if we are in a liberal, moderate, restrictive, or closed season is based on the mallard population itself because it takes mallards to make mallards, but we also know that density dependence is a factor. So too many mallards can also affect their own survival and reproduction. And the second part of the matrix is the May pond count because this affects reproductive output as well as density dependence. We know that the duck population tracks with May ponds. So where we were last year was 6.5 million mallards and 5.25 million ponds, which put us in a liberal package. But if you look at the matrix, you're going to find something very interesting. It is that the moderate package is very hard to land on. That is, it's kind of a knife edge, and we land into the restrictive package pretty quickly. Why, you might ask? Lots of folks keep arguing that at some point, harvest has to have an impact, and for sure we know that, and it's baked into mid-continent AHM. That is, when the population hits a threshold, harvest quickly starts to have an impact, and we ratchet back and end up in a restrictive package pretty quickly as harvest hits that additive threshold. So again, stating that AHM is not adaptive is false, plain and simple. So why have we not adapted? Because at current harvest levels and under current populations, we do not have an indication that harvest is driving the population, and our objective function is to maximize harvest over an infinite time frame because that is what hunters told us they want. So we look to ensure duck hunters can shoot ducks and into the foreseeable future. That matrix is also updated each year as we test our 4 main hypotheses, which are the combination of compensatory or additive mortality and strong or weak density dependence. Each of these 4 hypotheses are given a weight based on the information that comes back. It's a feedback loop. And then that affects what the matrix looks like. Again, making AHM adaptive. You will note that the matrix doesn't look like it is changing much, but that is because currently, with the harvest we have in the system we have, the weights on those models are basically, let's say it's our body of evidence for those different hypotheses. Those weights for those models haven't changed much recently because the information going into it hasn't changed, right? As we've stated before, we are strongly within the sidebars of when harvest would cause the population to reach a point where we have to kind of pull that trigger. It's the population and the harvest and the state of the system. Not too great, not too little. So we haven't learned much in the recent past. Those weights have really changed at certain times, though, in the past. So what would it take for us to go to a moderate package? What are those thresholds for this coming year, and how far are we from them? Given a stable mallard population since last year, we will be at, if that happened, we would be at 6.5 million mallards. And even if the Mayponds completely bottom out and headed towards 3 million, we remain in a liberal package. Why? Density dependence and partially compensatory mortality baked into the model. But in reality, we are likely going to be down, let's say, my estimate is 10% for the mallard population. So that would put us at 5.85 million. And then let's say we are down a whopping 25% for Mayponds. I don't think this is real. I think we will be down maybe 10 to 15% for Mayponds too. But that would put us at a little over 3.9 million ponds. Okay, so in the matrix, this still lands us in a liberal season framework. So what would it take to get to the moderate threshold? And I'm not going to just pull one lever, but find a reasonable reduction in the mallard BPOP and also a decline in Mayponds. So let's say the mallard population declines by a little less than 20% to 5.2 million, and that would be a giant jump. And then the Mayponds would also have to decline by about 10% to 4.7 million, and that would put us in a moderate package. So just go 5% points more, as in mallards down and ponds down for maybe even either of those, and then we're already in a restrictive package. Remember, though, that the matrix can change based on model weights going into it, but it is likely going to look, I expect, pretty similar in the future until we get changes in weights and a lot of learning in that system going on. We also hear on other podcasts that the matrix just changed to keep us in a liberal framework, and that ain't true either. All you have to do is go and read the AHM document to know why it changes. It can change based on model weights, but it can also change from operational changes to the models. One being that in 2008, Alaskan mallards were excluded from the mid-continent mallard model, so everything had to be adjusted. And that change made sense because Alaskan mallards largely migrate down the Pacific Flyway and are instead now included in the Western mallard AHM model. The AHM model also had to be adjusted to work appropriately when we went to a 2-year cycle of decision-making. So nobody is changing the model to keep us in a liberal framework. It changes when harvest objectives change, it changes when model weights change, and it changes when operationally it must change to run properly. Again, although complex, all of this information is in the AHM report each year, and they actually link to all the scientific papers that are published that show you how the AHM mathematical machine is driven. Okay, now let's hit on some other species of interest in AHM and dissect them a bit. I am not touching the Atlantic Flyway models because they are a mess and certainly need refining through further collaboration with high-quality scientists throughout U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and academia. Instead, I'm going to hit on a few species-specific AHM models. And not to throw the Atlantic Flyway under the bus too much, but I would say those models are working well enough for decision-making, but they definitely could be better. First, the highly flawed and needs to be updated Scott model. The Scott model is already conservative because it aims for 95% of maximum sustained yield or harvest, but what makes it flawed is that it specifically includes too much weight for the idea that harvest of Scott is additive. Specifically, we had a great paper come out in 2016 that determined if increasing harvest or declining survival rates have contributed to population changes so that they could determine if harvest has been primarily additive or compensatory. Now I'm going to read right from the paper. Annual survival rates exhibited no evidence of long-term declines or negative correlations with annual recovery rates for any age or sex class, suggesting that declining fecundity or reproductive output, numbers of ducklings per female, was the most likely explanation for population declines during 1975 to 2005. We conclude that hunting mortality played a minor role in affecting population dynamics of lesser scaup, and waterfowl managers could take a less cautious approach in managing harvest, especially if recruiting or maintaining waterfowl hunters are viewed as important management objectives. But the Scott model continues to be massively conservative, likely to the detriment of diver hunting culture. That last part was not from the paper, that's from me. But the Scott model continues to be massively conservative, likely to the detriment of diver hunting culture. So why no update to the model? Well, everyone is hard at work on other projects that have been requested by the flyways and hunters, including the pintail AHM. We covered this previously, so going to be short here. The model was updated to allow for more liberal seasons, that is, the pintail AHM, because it was putting too much emphasis on harvest. But in general, the pintail model continues to use the pintail breeding population and the mean latitude of the breeding population, because we know that as the pintails move out of the prairies when they're dry and into the parklands and boreal to breed, that age ratios in the fall harvest change drastically. That is, they just aren't as productive when it is dry in the prairies and the pintails breed farther north. They simply produce less ducklings per hen, so we just can't harvest as many of them without hitting the adult population. Makes sense, right? Okay, let's see, who else do we want to discuss? Let's do black ducks, and I'll admit I'm least familiar with this and how this model functions, but it does have some key components, one of which is maintaining parity in the harvest between Canada and the US, or trying to stay near a 50-50 harvest split, so no country gains or loses any more than the other, kind of fairly dividing up the harvest. It's kind of stayed at least, I think, 40-60 splits. So when people complain about Canadians having a more liberal black duck bag, let's just consider that they have way less hunters, and in some areas of eastern Canada, the black duck is king and nearly the only game in town. But again, this model is based on 98% of maximum sustained yield, so slightly conservative baked in. The black duck model contained two hypotheses originally, that the population is limited by competition with mallards, and the other one is that the black duck population is limited by harvest. Unfortunately, the eastern mallard population model was not performing well and was removed because it was uninformative. So they went with sub-models of the harvest model, which tested to what extent harvest was additive, which led us to a more liberal season, because additivity or harvest driving the black duck population was always underperforming relative to a random model, which found consistent populations through time despite varied harvest pressure. In simplest terms, this landed us in a 2 black duck daily bag going up from 1, or said another way, right from the AHM document again, and this is a quote, "Optimal country-specific regulatory strategies for the 25-26 hunting season were calculated using 1, the black duck harvest objective, which is 98% of the long-term cumulative harvest, 2, current country-specific regulatory alternatives, 3, the current parameter estimate for additive mortality, 4, 2024 estimates of 0.86 million breeding black ducks in eastern Canada, and 5, the country-specific 24-25 regulations, liberal in Canada and moderate in the U.S. Whew. All right, folks, that's a deeper dive into AHM on the Foul Weather Podcast than we've ever done before. We hope y'all learned something, and come back with us next week when we get back into the Young Waterfowl Professional Series. Thanks for listening, and as always, may your skies be filled and shoot straight, my friends.